There is a civilization whose warriors wrote their administrative records in one of the world's earliest alphabets, whose kings commanded fleets across the Aegean, and whose greatest military campaign became the foundational story of Western literature. For nearly 2 centuries, scholars believed they understood who these people were and where they had come from. The genome, when scientists finally sequenced it, told a different story than any prevailing theory had anticipated. Not slightly different, structured differently, from the ground up. The warriors who fought at Troy have been studied from every available angle: archaeology, linguistics, ancient texts, comparative mythology. Each discipline seemed to reinforce the same general account. That account was not exactly wrong, but it was incomplete in a way nobody could see until researchers began reading the bones directly. What ancient DNA revealed is that the Mycenaean Greeks were the product of a history no existing theory had correctly predicted. Not what the Northern invasion model said. Not what the Aegean continuity model said. Something neither camp had imagined. A layered population assembled from distinct ancestral streams across separate eras, each real, none of them the whole story. The standard account goes roughly like this. Sometime around 1900 BCE, Indo-European speaking peoples began moving into the Greek peninsula from the north. Pastoral, horse breeding, organized around warrior hierarchies. The same broad cultural complex that spread Indo-European languages across Europe and Central Asia during the Bronze Age. Over generations, they merged with the earlier inhabitants of mainland Greece and built Mycenaean civilization. By the 16th century BCE, their elite were being buried in the shaft graves at Mycenae, stone-lined tombs containing gold death masks, bronze weapons inlaid with hunting scenes, and silver vessels that announce the wealth of a warrior aristocracy. When Schliemann excavated Mycenae in the 1870s, he was so convinced he had found Agamemnon that he reportedly telegraphed the king of Greece to announce it. Archaeology later clarified that the shaft graves predate the Trojan War by centuries, but the cultural link held. The Mycenaeans spoke the earliest attested form of Greek, recorded in the Linear B script on clay tablets from Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns. Their language belonged unmistakably to the Indo-European family. The origin story, debated in its details, seemed structurally settled. But the question of who these people were at the biological level remained unresolved well into the 20th century. The debate was entangled with the longer mystery surrounding the Minoans, the Bronze Age civilization on Crete that flourished centuries before the Mycenaeans reached their height. Arthur Evans, who excavated the Great Palace at Knossos in the early 1900s, proposed that the Minoans had originated in North Africa. Refugees, he speculated, who fled Egypt after the pharaoh Narmer consolidated power around 3000 BCE. Other archaeologists proposed Anatolia, the Levant, or the Balkans. Neither question had been resolved by chemistry rather than archaeology. The complication arrived in August 2017, when a study published in Nature presented something that had not previously existed. Actual genome-wide data from 19 ancient individuals recovered from Bronze Age sites across the Aegean, Minoans from Crete, Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, and related individuals from southwestern Anatolia. For the first time, researchers had the biological record, and the data, rather than settling the debate cleanly, revealed that both dominant theories had captured part of the truth while missing something real. The first theory, the one most consistent with the linguistic evidence, held that the Mycenaeans were primarily descendants of northern migrants. Indo-European speakers swept in, their genetic stamp overwhelmed the local population, and Greek was the regional expression of a broader steppe migration. This had real support. The Indo-European ancestry of the Greek language is not a hypothesis. It is among the most thoroughly documented facts in comparative linguistics. Words for father, water, and the names of several deities connect Mycenaean Greek to Sanskrit, Latin, and ancient Persian through a shared ancestral tongue spoken on the Eurasian steppes before the Bronze Age. If the language came from the north, the reasoning followed. So did the people who carried it. Here is where the data fractured the model. When researchers examined the genome-wide profiles of actual Mycenaean individuals, the proportion traceable to northern steppe populations was real, but not dominant. At least 3/4 of the Mycenaean genome derived from the first Neolithic farmers of western Anatolia and the Aegean. The northern signal was present and consistent, but it had not replaced the prior population. The invasion model, as the primary account, could not survive those proportions. The second theory cut the other way. It proposed that the Mycenaeans were not primarily northerners at all, but the biological successors of the Aegean farming world, fundamentally continuous with the Minoans, differentiated mainly by geography and time. The evidence was real. Mycenaean art absorbed Minoan influences so thoroughly that scholars debated whether Minoan artists had worked directly at Mycenaean palaces. The Linear B script appears to be a direct adaptation of Minoan Linear A. Trade goods, pottery styles, and religious iconography show continuity across the Aegean. On this view, Mycenaeans and Minoans were regional variations of the same foundational population. The genome ended that argument as well. Minoans, when sequenced, carried no detectable steppe-related ancestry, none. And the Mycenaeans carried a consistent steppe-derived component, estimated at roughly 4 to 16% across the individuals sampled, entirely absent from the islanders. This represents a distinct ancestral stream, traceable to hunter-gatherer populations from Eastern Europe and Siberia, that contributed meaningfully to the Mycenaean genome and not at all to the Minoan one. The two populations shared deep roots. They were not the same people. The study, led by Iosif Lazaridis of Harvard Medical School, published in Nature on August 2, 2017, with co-corresponding author David Reich, presented genome-wide data assembled from 19 ancient individuals and provided the first genuinely comprehensive answer to a question that had circled the field for over a century. And the answer was not a single origin. It was a recipe. The Mycenaean Greeks were built from at least 3 distinct ancestral contributions. The largest, accounting for at least 3/4 of their ancestry, came from the first Neolithic farmers of western Anatolia and the Aegean, people who had arrived thousands of years before the Bronze Age and whose descendants had been dominant ever since. The second component, shared with the Minoans, traced to ancient populations related to those of the Caucasus and Iran, a migration from the east entering the Aegean after the earliest farming period. And the third, present only in the Mycenaeans, was that steppe-derived signal, ancestry from hunter-gatherers of Eastern Europe and Siberia, introduced through populations related to the Bronze Age inhabitants of the Eurasian grasslands. Lazaridis described it this way after the paper's publication. The Greeks have always been a work in progress, in which layers of migration through the ages added to, but did not erase, the genetic heritage of the Bronze Age populations. Here is an analogy that might make the scale of this legible. Suppose you discovered that a novel you had read your whole life, one that felt utterly singular, its voice immediately recognizable, had been written by 3 different people across 3 different centuries. Not assembled randomly, but composed through a process in which each generation absorbed what came before and built on it without erasing it. The voice in the end is still one voice. The achievement is still one achievement. But the origin of that voice is more complex, more surprising, and in some ways more impressive than you had imagined. That is what the Mycenaean genome tells us. The warrior who sailed for Troy, if we follow the Homeric tradition back to its historical roots, was himself a palimpsest. 3/4 of his ancestry had been farming the eastern Mediterranean for millennia before anyone spoke a word of Proto-Greek on the Eurasian plains. A fraction of him traced eastward to the Caucasus, to populations that had moved through the region from Iran and Armenia, and a smaller but distinct portion connected him to the grasslands of Eastern Europe. To the people whose language, carried west and south over centuries, eventually became the tongue in which Homer composed his verse. None of those threads was the whole story. All of them were real. None of this diminishes what the Mycenaeans built. It does the opposite. Because what the data describes is not confusion. It is the normal process by which civilizations actually form. A deep Aegean Neolithic foundation, farming the same soil for thousands of years. A later input from the east, from populations moving through the Caucasus and Iran. And then a smaller but distinct contribution from the northern grasslands, the people whose language eventually became Greek. That last thread is worth sitting with. The steppe-related ancestry in the Mycenaean genome connects, through the same migration that carried Indo-European languages westward, to a Proto-Indo-European root word for star that became aster in Greek and stella in Latin, the same ancestral source as the English word stellar. The warrior who sailed for Troy likely spoke words whose deepest roots were forged on the Eurasian plains long before Greece existed as a concept. The Iliad was composed in a language that carried the freight of multiple human journeys across thousands of miles and thousands of years. Not a smaller story, a larger one. There is a detail that received little attention when the 2017 study was published. Before Lazaridis and his colleagues achieved genome-wide sequencing, an earlier team had extracted mitochondrial DNA from skeletal remains in Grave Circle B at Mycenae, the burial precinct containing some of the earliest Mycenaean elite burials, dating roughly 1700 to 1450 BCE. Of 22 individuals sampled, usable mitochondrial DNA was recovered from only 4. Among those 4, 1 male and 1 female shared the same haplogroup, a result researchers interpreted as evidence they were siblings. The woman had been buried there, not by marital connection, but apparently by right of birth. The genome study confirmed what that earlier finding had suggested, that the people inside the shaft graves were already, in the 16th century BCE, a composite. Different human streams meeting on the same peninsula and producing something that became, in time, the world those warriors carried into legend. What the ancient DNA of the warriors who fought at Troy finally reveals is this: the past is not a fixed point of origin. It is a direction of travel. And the only honest map of any people's history is the one that shows all the roads.